Morning, everyone, and we are live for this Elemental webinar talking about improving the take-up of home energy efficiency measures. To cover it, I'm joined by Will Rivers from the Carbon Trust, Rachael Owens from the National Retrofit Hub, and Heather Buchanan from Bankers for Net Zero. Hello everyone, and welcome.
Hi, welcome.
Right, so we're just going to get straight into it. So to kick things off, if we can start with you, Rachael, can you give us an overview of the sorts of things that you're working on at the National Retrofit Hub on this topic, and maybe mention how big the challenge is of encouraging an increased home energy retrofit?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know at the Hub that we need to exponentially scale the pace of retrofit, and we also need to get better at recording what we are doing, particularly in the able to pay sector. And we sort of see this as a few different challenges. I think the first one is really in creating this mindset shift in the way that we think about our homes. So there was a really interesting Which study that came out last year that said that almost half of UK homeowners hadn't actually looked into insulating their homes, and the most common reason was that they already thought their homes were insulated enough. But those same people, quite a lot of them, were still concerned about their energy bills. So we've got this sort of mismatch between people associating the performance of their homes, their health and their comfort with their bills. So at the Hub, we've got 6 different working groups, and they're covering a variety of topics. Our 6th one is looking at this issue in a bit more detail. The group's called Driving Uptake, and it's being chaired by Cara Holmes of Citizens Advice. And the real aim of that group is to try and embed retrofit knowledge and understanding at every milestone within a project. So whether you're doing an extension, a loft conversion, changing your kitchen, moving house, we want people to be thinking about retrofit and energy efficiency at all of those different stages. So that group's currently doing a bit of a literature review on the existing research on demand for net zero. And it's also going to be looking at a bit of persona mapping, including really who holds the power to make decisions and where we need to enable more agency. And then I think the next challenge is really, when a citizen wants retrofit, how do we enable them to get it in a way which works for them? So I think we need to have a lot better access to information. That same Which study showed that 69% of homeowners who did search for information, they wanted advice that was more tailored to their property, more relevant to their own personal circumstances, and lots of them didn't know where to start. So some of our working groups are looking at that as an issue. So thinking about how we can have archetypal guidance potentially in the short term, but then maybe in the more medium and long term, support the delivery and rollout of property logbooks so people have specific building renovation plans for their own homes. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that later in the discussion. I know also we're going to talk about finance, which I think is really key here, and enabling that access to finance.
Thank you, which leads me on to Heather. Can you explain the role of Bankers for Net Zero in this space and what you're doing to sort of drive the take-up of retrofit?
Certainly. Thanks very much. So Bankers for Net Zero, we're a not-for-profit membership body. And a bit of a misnomer in that we're not just banks, we also have businesses as well as civil society, NGOs, academia, policymakers, kind of all built in. So we very specifically look at a point where financial institutions, whether it's banks, but also institutional asset owners, asset managers. So this really does run across any kind of property that's been financed. Financial institutions have committed to decarbonizing their financed emissions by 2050. So that means that they are now on the hook for every mortgage, every kind of corporate loan they write. And this, of course, presents a significant challenge because of the housing stock in the UK and the fact that we are so kind of behind the times in terms of retrofitting. So we look very closely at where the policy levers, what are the policy blockers, what are the policy enablers within the system, make things work. And then we work closely with the likes of the Green Finance Institute, who we co-chair the finance working group of the National Retrofit Hub with, looking at different policies and mechanisms to make it more affordable for people to think. And really, I always like to say, right now, retrofitting is it's a bit of a boutique thing, isn't it? I mean, I've, will anecdotally say that it took me quite a while we've recently engaged an architect in Scotland, and actually, to concertedly go out and look for somebody that really specialises in this is still quite difficult. And we need to move this from kind of the boutique shop down the way to something that in people's consciousness is a bit more IKEA. It's your first home, your first stop. This is the first thing you do. So we look at that through the lens of finance and think, how can we get that going? And Rachael, absolutely, the idea of kind of building passports or building kind of renovation logs, we think would be a huge game changer just in terms of it starting to enable people, but also looking at things like EPC reform. So energy performance certificates are incredibly outdated and quite a blunt tool, and they aren't accurate enough to really get competitive pricing into the market. So if we're looking for lenders to provide better rates for doing bits of work, we need to be more precise about the metrics we use. And then also, I think, looking at things like property-based finance, where if you're a young couple moving into your first home and it's not going to be your forever home, you're going to be there for a few years, and you've got 32 pence in the bank account by the time you've paid your stamp duty and gotten the keys, the last thing you're going to do is start spending cash on a big retrofit program. So how do we kind of take away that upfront capital risk for people and actually incentivize them to work forward? So we work quite closely with government departments, financial institutions, and also the likes of the National Retrofit Hub to kind of see where we can go there. But I think on the policy level, our big push for things is this is such a complex area with so many different types of, if you're an owner occupier, if you're a tenant, social housing, that there's not ever going to be a one size fits all intervention. And our policymakers need to get much more bold and much more holistic about the way that we kind of intervene and motivate people. And I think just my last little quip, because I'm currently sitting in Edinburgh and live in Scotland, I think there's also an opportunity to look at things and trial things in different ways in devolved nations, because we see housing and energy are devolved matters. So I'd like to kind of create a bit of a race to the top amongst the devolved nations as well.
Bit of healthy competition, definitely. Thanks very much. Will, can you outline Carbon Trust's sort of position in this space? And also, I know you've got your own experience of retrofit.
Yeah, sure. Morning, everybody. So I'm Will from the Carbon Trust. I lead a lot of our domestic retrofit work. There's quite a few strands to that. So I particularly work on innovation programs. So we support government with delivery of a few of their key innovation programs in this space. So things like Heat Pump Ready. Lucy, you'll know we bought a lot of the Heat Pump Ready projects to install a show last year. And I work also on the Green Homes Finance Accelerator, which is really interesting. So that's, a super fascinating perspective on these companies that are really trying to tackle these problems and transform the market for home retrofit. We also do a lot of work on an energy systems perspective, I guess. So we work a lot with the networks, local authorities and government. I guess to try and understand from a macro perspective, what is it that we need to do to transform the energy system? Where does domestic fit within that? Questions like how much do we actually need to reduce demand by 2050 versus completely electrifying supply? What's the role of flexibility in all of this? So we do quite a lot of work on energy transitions in the bigger scheme of things, I guess. I'd say the final thing we do, so at Carbon Trust, we work a lot with corporates and organizations as well. So we work a lot with people like major house builders. We work with some big housing associations on their net zero strategy. So how they get to net zero within their organizations, which I think is another kind of really, essential perspective, if you like. These are the companies and the organizations that are actually going to develop some of these propositions and help decarbonize the stock. On a good day, I'd say we've got a good, well-rounded perspective of how we need to motivate homeowners to do this type of stuff. how within the whole energy system, the networks and the policy and the the government support, if you like, needs to help people in the right ways, but also what are the business models and the companies that will actually deliver a lot of this stuff in practice. So yeah, that's a bit of background on the Carbon Trust. Yeah, my own retrofit experience. So we've just submitted planning permission for a rear extension and external wall insulation, triple glazing. Happy to chat about that at length and the challenges of it. I like to get as hands-on as possible, looking at air tightness and detail. But yeah, we can talk about that more later maybe.
Lovely, thank you very much. The sort of first area that I really want us to focus on is the sort of the biggest barrier. Well, is it the biggest barrier? That's what I want to know. So staying with you, Will, is cost the biggest barrier in your experience for homeowners? Is the finance the issue that stops everyone, getting a heat pump or insulation or improving their windows or whatever? Is it always the biggest barrier?
I think kind of the obvious answer to that, I guess, is that it depends who you are and it depends what you want to do. I think there's undoubtedly a section of society which is far too big, where even if a complete retrofit of a house was £1,000, that's still £1,000 that they don't have, and so it's just not an option. That is a huge kind of portion of the housing stock falls into that category. And so cost is, even if all the other barriers kind of went out the window, cost is a fundamental one that you can't overcome in that sense. But I mean, it's a spectrum, isn't it? And the other end of that spectrum is that there is a huge portion at the wealthier end of society that do have either the savings, other financial means, the ability to extend their mortgage, the ability to get an unsecured loan, high disposable incomes, so they could afford an energy as a service or heat as a service package. There's 2.1 million households in the UK who own a second home. So to say that there's not, the wealth or the financial means somehow within that section of society to retrofit, I think it's absolutely not the biggest barrier for that portion of society. I think for me, the biggest barrier for them, well, I mean, there's a few. So, there's something like 500,000 people will undertake some kind of major renovation on their property in any given year, whether that's a loft conversion, extension, replacing their glazing, doing major internal home improvements. And we know that a lot of those people would like to do energy efficiency as part of that renovation, but they either don't know how, and certainly I think it's the case that the majority of the supply chain in that space, architects and kind of general builders, don't have the kind of know-how and the skills to be able to support them to do that. So yeah, I mean, just with our renovation journey, because I work in the sector, I'm able to tap into architects who I know can do this. I think if you're approaching kind of the majority of architects, the majority of builders, the majority of development control and building control people, you could go through a whole £100,000 renovation on your property, and at no point has anybody really given you the ability or the knowledge or the skills to incorporate energy efficiency properly into that retrofit. So yeah, so I think for that section of society, cost isn't the barrier. It's knowledge, and also the fact that solutions don't exist out there in a way that is easy for people to engage with, or that the supply chain just has those skills as default.
Absolutely. I'll just pop in here really quickly if I can, and we'll just going on the kind of the personal side of things. Even from a position of fairly high knowledge in this, I must admit that as I look at my leaky, drafty, single glazed, uninsulated Scottish farmhouse with an abundance of unintended internal water features, I still look around that and think, well, if you took a few hundred, a couple hundred quid off a month off the mortgage or something like that, it would not incentivize me or make me be able to afford, with 3 kids and all the rest of it, doing the work. And so I think and that's coming from a position where I kind of sit on webinars and talk about it, and still I can't necessarily afford to kind of walk the talk, as it were.
Yeah, it's well, as Will and Rachel probably know, I've had my own experience with trying to get a heat pump and solar and things like that as well. It's not easy, even if you do have well, in my case, low level of the understanding of the industry. Staying with you, Heather, then. So what are banks doing to support customers who are really keen to retrofit? There's different sort of financial models available, isn't there, from different banks and different financial institutions?
Yes, but I would still say that it's still fairly vanilla in terms of, you can potentially access better rates and whatnot. But I mean, that going to Will's point, that still means that you need to be able to access the finance in the first instance, which not everybody can. I mean, I think this is where things like heat as a service could really come into its own. So, and this is something even that energy companies, I know are looking at, but rather than have to front the upfront cost of a heat pump, just make that just part of your monthly, just like your mobile phone. You end up with, that cost, or the router you get with your broadband. Obviously, the issue with that is a lot of times because of the other fabric, building work that needs to be done to help accommodate heat pumps and stuff, makes it a bit difficult. I think the property linked finance, just said before, is a model that they use in the States, in France, and in Germany. Again, where you can take and we're certainly looking at that, and I think we need some changes, some tweaks to regulation that sits around that. But essentially, having a debt that sits with the property rather than the people. So again, back to my example of the young couple with 32 pence in their pocket, they could be incentivized by saying, well, actually, before you move in, if you get this work done, A, you might get a tax break on your stamp duty, and then B, you won't have to pay the upfront cost of it. If there's 40 grand of work, that 40,000 will sit and be amortized over 25 years with the property, and you just pay it back via your council tax, something like that. So then it just becomes a normal part, and you have a nicer place to live in and a warmer home, but there's been no upfront capital. But I think we have to be really, really realistic that asking people to stump up lots of cash up front is difficult. The government cannot afford to pay for everybody's houses to get retrofitted, so we need to find some better models for doing that.
Rachel, from your experience at the Hub, what are your sort of working groups hearing about the types of finance that are already being accessed, or maybe that are asking for?
Yeah, there's a few different bits that I wanted to touch on here. So in October, we had a roundtable with some banks, building societies, delivery organisations, also with Bankers for Net Zero and Green Finance Institute. There's a write-up of it on our website, but there are a few really interesting takeaways. So as Heather's discussed, there are green products out there. There are 0% interest loans, there are green mortgages, there are cashback schemes, but the uptake of those is relatively low and nowhere near high enough to get to the scale that we need to. And it seems like they only necessarily target that able to pay market that were probably likely to do some work anyway, but maybe they were incentivized to do it a bit quicker because they could get that finance. We also found that financiers needed a better way to limit their liability and ensure the performance improvements and quality were met with the retrofit works. And there's a bit of a disparity of scale where you've often got these huge banks trying to work with small local retrofit companies, and their expectation between them is often difficult to meet in terms of what the banks need from those delivery organisations. There's also a big risk in the fact that a lot of the time we're using EPC derived estimates on cost savings, and as Heather's mentioned, that can be very inaccurate and not really reflect what the impact of the work's going to be. So I think what really came out of that was that we need better integration between finance and delivery, and I think the Green Homes Finance Accelerator scheme that Will mentioned is a really interesting one there. So that's where different partnerships are coming together to try and make products that can give a consumer everything at once. So, for example, one of them is Parity Projects, working with Santander, CoreLogic, Loco Home, Retrofit, CSE, and Knight Frank. And they're creating a one-stop shop that has advice, surveys, creates a whole house plan, and then it embeds financial offers within it so that you as a homeowner can go to just one place. But what I would say is that with all of this, there's this big gap between over here, the grant-funded, fuel-poor households who are able to receive government funding, and then over here, they're able to pay sector, and we've got this massive gap in the middle of people that don't qualify really for either. And I think that's where we need more innovation in the market. So there's some movement happening with place-based integrated approaches. So, for example, West Midlands are trialling a net zero neighbourhoods approach. The idea behind that is it's something that lots of people, including 3CI, have developed, has some backing from DESNZ. What they want to do is create a revenue stream from the energy savings over a long period of time, which then attracts capital investors to provide some of that upfront funding. And then they would blend that with contributions from small amounts of contributions from public subsidies, and creating an investment vehicle where the government has to put in less, the household maybe doesn't have to pay up front, and then also there's an investor that's getting some payback from this over the longer time. But I think in all of this, we kind of also need to understand the value of where retrofit's being seen. So the fact that it reduces the cost to the NHS, to the energy operators, that it's providing improved resilience to flood and overheating, and try and sort of leverage some of that value in order to fund it. And I know Matter Labs did some really good work in Birmingham, mapping the value that a better performing home can provide to all of these wider systems. So I think it's kind of we need to innovate in this way that we bring this value together in order to piece together the funding.
Thank you. Staying on the sort of innovation topic, Heather, is it possible to have a sort of standardised approach to financing this, or do you think there needs to be a more tailored approach for individual circumstances, individual properties, or is that far too complicated?
I mean, I think that inevitably it will be necessary to segment things down to a certain extent. But I think, what's interesting is, post 1950s homes and that have been built en masse, they're kind of a bit more open towards that kind of like mass retrofit area where you can go kind of street by street. And I think if we could get this a bit more, and I'm sure the work's been done to a certain extent, but looking at the different, because you have to, it's almost a cross section. It's not just the cross section between what people can afford it in their own personal circumstances, but then it's looking at what types of properties there are. And I think that within those kind of blocks, then yes, then you can get different variations of finance. I think this is another area where looking at the options of government guarantees is quite interesting. So in order to get more finance flowing, or finance flowing at a much kind of lower rate, the government could potentially step behind and provide a proportion of a guarantee that incentivizes lenders to bring their costs down for that kind of longer term funding as well. So there's lots of things that can be done, but it is a complex matrix, unfortunately.
Several of you have already mentioned heat as a service. Are you expecting that to sort of, as take up of it or the rollout of it increases, to have an impact on the retrofit landscape, or are you expecting that to be a small part of the puzzle? Can I go to Rachael for this one, please?
Yeah, sure. I'd be interested to hear Heather's view as well. But I mean, I think the benefits of the heat of the service is that, well, firstly, you're getting a lot of data, so you can make targeted interventions based on the data that you're collecting as part of that process. And you can also measure what improvements you're making. But fundamentally, it shifts the obligation onto the energy provider rather than the resident. So in that way, we're helping to offer something that creates like a commercial incentive for the energy provider, which could be quite a good lever. And it's also helping to spread the cost of improvements over the lifetime of that sort of intervention. I also had some thoughts on sort of other interventions that we need to see and other innovations in policy, but I don't know, Heather, if you wanted to add anything on heat as a service before I change the subject slightly.
No, just that I think that the faster that companies can get on with it and start offering it, the better. So I really do think it would be a bit of a game changer.
Can I just throw in one thought on heat as a service? Because I think absolutely it could start to play a fundamental role. I mean, it's still very embryonic in terms of its scale. But you look at the car industry, 90% of new cars are bought with some and so it's, you can see how that it could go that way. I think the difference there, though, is that in order for heat as a service to work for things like heat pumps, for example, you need to spread the costs over 10 or more years, which is kind of going beyond the average length of time that people stay in their houses on average. And so I think it is a bit more complicated when it comes to people's houses, heat as a service. But yeah, I think it's huge potential.
Yeah, the other sort of topic that I wanted to touch on a little bit was the fact that there are so many different types of households and different tenures. And so I think we need more innovation in incentivising upgrades in the private rental sector as well. So Generation Rent did some really interesting research where they were talking about the fact that there are roughly similar amounts of private renters in fuel poverty as there are owner-occupiers in fuel poverty. But owner-occupiers access 5 times as many eco-grants to upgrade their homes because the incentive doesn't really exist there for people in private rental. They could try and get a grant and ask their landlord to upgrade their home, but then they're at risk of rent increases and eviction. The value of that retrofit doesn't really always land with them. So I think there's definitely some innovation that we need to see there in the policy space as well as in the product space to really help that sector, because I think it's something that we often forget, and there's a lot of potential there to improve people's lives.
Yeah. I can't remember who it was. There was a politician that we interviewed before Christmas, and he was talking about there being sort of tax breaks and things available for. Well, they were suggesting that there would be tax breaks available for landlords in those situations so that they would be incentivised. But yeah, that's a really good point. Is that then going to put the tenant at risk of rents going up and things like that? It's a really delicate situation, isn't it? Particularly as renters in this country probably don't feel very secure in their homes a lot of the time with the sort of turnover of tenancies and things. Sort of on the innovation side as well, a couple of you have mentioned products, but is there enough focus on making sure that the right products and solutions are put in a retrofit project and that it is, again, this tailored approach? Will, do you think that this is something that the industry knows enough about and is focused on enough, or are they just thinking, we'll get some installation and a heat pump in, and there's not enough sort of tailored approach each time?
I think it really varies across the industry. I think one of the bugbears I have, I guess, is there's quite a lot of attention put into retrofit assessment that assumes that essentially the only thing the person wants to do to their house is improve the energy performance. So you get an energy performance certificate, for example, and there's lots of other forms of quite sophisticated advice that will really break down, these are the pounds and pence that you will save on your energy bill if you install external wall insulation. But particularly looking towards that able to pay end of the market, that's just not how they see their houses, as a kind of energy using unit essentially. And there's all kinds of other considerations, like they want more space, they want more light, they want to redecorate this, they want the latest this, that, or the other, that go kind of beyond those energy renovations. And I think that's a bit of a failing of the industry at the moment, is that we've got, on the one hand, we're trying to build this kind of new market essentially for energy efficiency and green retrofit. And on the other hand, we've already got this huge existing market for home improvement. And those two industries don't tend to get on that well at the moment and really talk to each other that well. Of what people want to do to their houses and build energy retrofits into that, rather than kind of try and sell them something which they're not currently looking for in its own right, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think in other sectors, you know, in the heat pump sector, for example, you know, I think it's fair to say at the moment that the standards of installation are below where we ultimately need them to be for heat pumps to become the default choice. You know, heat pumps well installed and operated flexibly can absolutely be a superior option to a gas boiler and cost you less to run and keep you warmer and keep your house in a better state. But there's too many examples at the moment of where they don't do any of those things necessarily and don't work effectively. So yeah, I mean, that's more of a technical issue in terms of improving standards, understanding how to, for example, measure the energy use of a house so that the right size heat pump is installed and the rest of the system design is done correctly, so that it really does outperform the gas boiler it's replacing.
I mean, this question was on the list that I shared in advance, but I mean, it strikes me that none of the things that we've been talking about today are really possible unless EPCs are reformed as a sort of first step, because people don't know necessarily about their energy performance, or they don't know realistically how efficient it is and what improvements could be made. So that, I mean, that has got to be the first step on this sort of, as far as policy goes anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably something that Elena would want to come in on as well, but we definitely see that there needs to be change in EPCs in order that they are fit for purpose. We think that they're an incredibly useful tool if they work properly, because they enable you to target and they enable finance to be unlocked. But in order to do that, they do need to be developed. But I think also there are room for other tools as well. So one of the things that we've been working on in our working group 1, which is called Warm, Healthy, Net Zero, is the idea of property logbooks. So we've been doing some work with the Residential Logbook Association and logbook providers. And the idea behind this would be that it's a sort of digital data repository that includes information on your home. So the RLBA has been working up these under the sort of mandate to improve the way that we buy and sell homes. So everything that you might normally ask for when you buy and sell, all those legal records, what if they were in one digital repository and you didn't get instead 25 PDFs that are all scanned upside down and that are impossible to decipher? And so what we're looking at is how can we expand those to include more detailed building information, what might be akin to a retrofit assessment that would come out of a past 2035 process. You know, could that be embedded in a property logbook so that you have one done once and it speaks to other different systems and is able to be aggregated? And then also within that, could you embed building renovation plans? So you've got a retrofit plan for every home, which is probably partially produced in a sort of machine learning way, but the majority of it would be produced by a surveyor and then captured, become dynamic, be able to be updated as you progress through your retrofit plan, because most people aren't going to do all this work at once. And I think that they're a really key document to be able to unlock some of these issues, because they could also include energy use from smart meter data, and they can just go much further than EPC. So they would sit sort of alongside an EPC and be something that you own as you part of owning the home. And then they also have the potential to aggregate projects so that you can understand, okay, in this local area, there are 2,000 homes which have got external wall insulation as part of their retrofit plan. Let's do those together. So I think we can't rely solely on EPCs to like give us all the information we need, but reforming them to be more accurate would also be really useful. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that, Elena, as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. I agree on that. And at Bankers for Net Zero, we work a lot with banks, financial institutions, and corporates in general. And one one of the things that they always raise up as a massive blocker for financing retrofits is energy performance certificates. The main reason is that they are very difficult to track, they are inaccurate, and financial institutions are ultimately risk averse in a way that if they don't understand things, they won't finance them, and they need to understand this in a fairly granular detail. So that's why we need the right measurement tools, because if financial institutions cannot track the value of their green loans, then they won't feel confident in their investment decisions, and then finance will not flow. That's why it's very important from a financial lens to reform EPCs, because if we do this right, then we will be able to mobilize capital a lot more towards retrofit initiatives. So that's why we are working with the National Retrofit Hub, and we launched a campaign on EPC reform with our partners, members, and other organizations.
Thank you very much. Just got one more topic that I want to cover before we'll go to the audience questions. So do add any questions that you've the question box, please, everyone. So the last topic that I wanted to talk about was communication and the kind of customer journey, I guess. Will, can we go to you first for this one, particularly with your own retrofit experience? But what would you say is the importance of communication between all the different organisations involved in a project? As you said, you've got architects, installers, contractors.
Yeah, I mean, I think at all different levels, it's really essential, and currently doesn't work very well. So, as I said, at the moment, you could be planning a major extension retrofit project, and none of the people that you talk to necessarily, your bank, your architect, your builder, development control, building control, your local builders merchant. At the moment, it's a very disjointed picture. So even if you've got an architect who really wants to kind of drive a particular really good performance, you can't necessarily find the builder who is going to deliver that. And they go to their builders merchants, and they don't have the products that would deliver that anyway. So I think of it, there's kind of a whole ecosystem there around renovation that needs changing and to be able to communicate before it can become the norm, if you like. But yeah, I mean, and then when you get into the actual building of the retrofit itself, there's just a huge number, and this is why most sensible people would pay people like architects to really understand these the joins. So for example, we're getting external wall insulation done and triple glazing done, but I'm probably going to project manage it myself, and so it's quite a critical junction between the window and the wall, and getting that airtight and potentially moving the level of the windows out so that they're in line with the new wall insulation. But if it's two completely separate companies doing that, which one kind of takes ownership of getting that detail right and getting the airtightness right? And probably neither of them is the answer. And so somebody has to take ownership of that. So I've done the PAS 2035 retrofit coordinator course, so I kind of feel somewhat able to manage that interaction. But it's incredibly tricky, and it's an incredibly difficult process to manage. And that's just one example. There's a dozen examples of we're going to get underfloor heating done by one company and potentially a heat pump done by another. And the timing of both of those things has got to interact with completely changing the heat loss of the building by externally insulating it. These are very complex things to try and get your head around in a project. I mean, there are people out there, people like Rachael as one great example, who can understand these things completely in depth and manage that interaction. The sector as a whole is not there yet, and we have had builders kind of come and talk to us about various elements of the retrofit, and in general, I'd say that the state of knowledge is woeful. It's not that it's kind of not quite there. It's completely not there. So you've really got to know where you're looking in terms of trades, in particular, to make all this work properly.
And most people don't, do they? Most homeowners or whatever don't have the knowledge that you have. Most people haven't done
And, you know, this is why, so I was involved in the kind of each home counts process back several years ago. And this is why PAS 2035 came about, because these things are really complicated to manage. But I'm painting too negative a picture. They're not. There's quite basic things that need to be taken into account that aren't always taken into account, is essentially what it comes down to. And so, yeah, the idea was that retrofit coordinators, retrofit designers would be able to manage these interactions well. And we're starting to see that have effect through programs like Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is great. I think what's lacking is, I mean, I always thought that, for example, architects, it would become a very essential thing for an architect to be a retrofit coordinator and a retrofit designer, as well as their, you know, as part of their list of qualifications. But I think for that able to pay market, we're not quite there yet. And general builders certainly aren't getting PAS 2030 accredited for external wall insulation. So I think there's still a big challenge there in that able to pay end of the market.
Definitely. Elena, could you talk to us about the sort of communication that needs to be done, engaging consumers with the finance options for retrofit? You know, what more can be done to sort of let them know what's available, what's out there for a project?
Yeah, so we mainly work with policymakers and financial institutions, but one of the things that we realize is that banks have some available, like green loans and green financing products. However, many customers are not aware of that existing. So I think there should be more of an open communication between financial institutions and customers so that they can realize what's available. So that could be in a form of like some sort of internal communications or awareness campaigns, so they really realize that. But in terms of financing, what we also realize is that many customers really want to engage in retrofitting their homes and so on, but they don't have access to finance, as Heather well mentioned. So there should be more incentives in place, such as I don't know, a lower stamp duty for more efficient homes, or enhanced capital allowances for retrofitting investments, zero VAT on low and zero carbon products. So there should be more government incentives for customers to engage, because if finance is not available, then even if they want to, then they won't be able to do so. And also, Bankers Volunteer is all about convening and acting as this bridge between the public and the private sector. So we organize a lot of roundtables with policymakers and banks. So we cannot do this in silos. It's very important that we collaborate to make sure that our approach is aligned and we get to wherever we want to be faster and together.
Thank you. Can you give us a few words on this, the sort of communication angle and the simplifying the customer journey, and what you think needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd really agree with everything that Will and Elena said there. I do think that people want more detailed information that's more relevant to them. And I think that I talked a bit about the logbooks, and there are lots of great businesses out there starting to already make those, but I think we want to try and enable the sector to do something that is interoperable, speaks to one another, and that scales up rollout of those. But I think also in the short term that it's going to be a while before we get to a place where every single home has a building renovation plan. That's not a quick, easy fix. And I think in the meantime, there's lots of great guidance out there that really can help engage both citizens, but also I think we'll touch on a really important point, these like small RMI builders who are the ones that are the first port of call for most people when they're doing work to their home. So, for example, Field and Clegg Bradley Studios produced a really great guide, the Devon Retrofit Guide. Bioregional have done something similar in Cambridge, which picks up common typologies for those areas and says, okay, for these types of homes, these are probably the likely types of measures that would be useful. They're absolutely not, the starting point for a design, because we need to make sure that we consider each home as an individual home, and every home is different. But I think that they're a really useful engagement tool to be able to sort of get people interested, get builders to understand, okay, these are the things that might be useful for this type of property. So I think that's kind of one key element, trying to make the information that is available more apparent, more engaging, easier to access. But then there's definitely a role for the sort of more innovative models that combine some of these services together. So I think the risk that Will was talking about in terms of not designing interfaces correctly, we've seen badly done retrofit in the past. That's the whole point of the Each Home Counts review. At the minute, the uptake over the past 2035 is unfortunately quite low in the non-government funded sector. So we're potentially missing opportunities to make sure that we do consider things like ventilation if we're making the building more airtight. So I think that those one-stop shops have a potential to give customers a better customer journey. There's some really nice examples of those. So I went to visit People Powered Retrofit up in Manchester, and there's something that Marianne Heaslip said to me that I always keep using this phrase, which was the idea of creating a self-reinforcing value network. So they also do educational events with builders, they upskill and do educational events with residents, and they are starting themselves to shift the industry in that area to broaden out the understanding. And I think that those sorts of organizations have got great potential to be able to do that, but they just need more support and more connections between them as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, so we've got about 15 minutes or so left to just go to some questions. I can answer this first one. Yes, it is possible to receive a recording of this afterwards. So there you go, there's the first one done. So there's a question here for you, Will, from Louise. It says, I assume this is referring to the Heat Pump Ready programme. How can heat pump installation standards be raised in the current landscape of race to the bottom, focusing on heat pumps being cheaper? So I'm not sure I agree there's a race to the bottom, but I get her point there. How can we make sure that heat pumps aren't just being stuck in anywhere and they're really well installed each time?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a big question. I'm not a heat pump installer, but I talk to a lot of them kind of daily at the moment. I mean, the thing that makes the difference between a heat pump being 150% efficient or potentially 450% efficient is not the heat pump, but the energy system it's attached to. So the flow of water around the house, essentially, the radiators, the size of them, the pipework being correct. And so I think there is essentially a training and upskilling issue on that side of low temperature heating system hydronics. That is, one of the fundamental kind of problems with the industry at the moment. There's a lot of great stuff happening, communities of practice, things like Heat Geek on YouTube. Heat Pumps UK is a great example of a kind of installer focused Facebook network that's really kind of spreading good practice kind of thick and fast, but that needs to happen a lot thicker and a lot faster, essentially, till you get to the point where you don't have those heat pump installations, which do exist, which are kind of really not performing as they should. So yeah, I mean, how you get there is a massive debate. MCS is currently going through a big transition at the moment in terms of how they deliver the standards. I think for me, if innovation is needed anywhere, it's in how training is delivered to the current gas boiler industry and heat pump installers to make sure it's fit for purpose and those people are actually equipped to go out and install high performing systems. I mean, the race to the bottom point I think is really interesting, because one of the things I think is really encouraging for the heat pump rollout as a whole is that these high performing systems are actually much simpler and cheaper to install than the way that heat pumps are typically installed at the moment. So they typically involve less zones, less pumps, less TRBs. They are more efficient, simpler systems to install. And so it's not necessarily the case that a cheap installation is a bad installation. If these things are done well, you can absolutely do that. I think, where the race to the bottom I think is problematic is that it starts to build this perception that heat pumps only cost £500 now. And for some houses, that's just not the case, because they need to upgrade that system, the pipes, the pumps, the heat emitters. And that can be expensive. That is where without grant, an installation could cost £20,000, and that's not the installer trying to rip you off. That is the cost of actually fundamentally transforming your house. So I know they're consulting on reviews to the bus grant at the moment to try and make it a bit more, use case sensitive. So where you've got these really big, where you've got larger houses that need more doing to them, you can potentially get more. Where you've got, the low hanging fruit, if you like, from an Octopus or British Gas perspective, grant is potentially more appropriate for that type of problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Rachel, there's a question here for you from Steve that says, don't you think the government should be doing more to inform residents, both private and rented sectors, on what they can do and what energy efficiency means, and to advertise more on what grants are available?
Yeah, well, I do think that. So, yeah, I think if we look back to the national, so we were formed off the back of the National Retrofit Strategy, which was published in 2021. And what that recommended was a sort of slower start to building up retrofit, a quick middle, and then tapering out the end. And the whole purpose of the slower start was that we needed to start building trust and awareness and understanding before going, okay, now we need to retrofit all the homes right now this second. Unfortunately, that wasn't picked up by the government at the time. We keep moving on. But I think it's really important that we do incentivize and make much more clear to people what is available to them. I think that there are mechanisms that we can do that with. I think there's a way that some of the work around logbooks could also integrate what finance is applicable to you, so you're automatically connected. But I think bigger than that, this is also a mindset shift, and you don't necessarily get a mindset shift with lots of technical sort of jargon. So the idea of a national campaign, I think, is a really good one. It's something that we would look to sort of making some proposals for, I think, in our working group 6. I think that I personally have learned a lot from what happened around the post office scandal, with the fictionalization of that, really bringing to the forefront what the issue was, making it something that people really cared about. I think we can take a lot from sort of campaigns like that have really helped shift the dial. So I think it's a really great idea, and I hope that whatever government gets in next will be open to discussing that with us further.
Brilliant, thank you. Question from Andy. Should we just install low carbon heat networks in towns and save insulation for rural homes? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
I mean, answer it-ish. I think this point about which homes need kind of deep retrofit, which homes need some retrofit, and which homes need low carbon heat is really interesting. And I think we've talked a lot about kind of deep retrofit projects today. And you think, well, how many houses are actually going to need that? And it's maybe not quite as many as some people think, and more than other people think. So the CCC in their kind of 6 carbon budget scenarios, in order to get to net zero by 2050, we need to reduce demand in those scenarios by anywhere between 5% and 22% is kind of what they think. And they say this is we can definitely do more and that will be better, but we can get to net zero essentially with that kind of range of demand reduction, which is actually less demand reduction in the next 30 years than we've achieved in the last 30 years, even though to some extent the last 30 years are kind of viewed as failure on energy efficiency. So I think it's just worth pointing out that this isn't an impossible target, and the level of demand reduction is completely achievable with fixing some of these problems, incentivizing homeowners to do the right thing. But yeah, so and government's done a lot of work on this. Cost optimal domestic electrification report is quite insightful, that there will be a lot of homes essentially that don't need further demand reduction in a really significant sense, and do just need essentially electrification of heat. I always think of it in terms of every home pretty much is going to need to have its heat electrified. Not every home is going to need to reduce demand. but pretty much all of them would benefit from it, is the way I view it.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I comment on that one as well? I think it's really important to say that, you know, retrofit isn't just about demand reduction and decarbonisation. It's also about the health and well-being of people that are living in these homes, particularly when we're looking at towns and cities. People living in really poor quality, really leaky, really damp homes. That is also a huge challenge, and a really important factor when we're thinking about retrofit, especially in terms of social value. So I think when we're thinking about upgrading, and also in terms of the messaging that we want to sort of spread to the public, that it's actually also about your health. And they've done quite good research in Ireland. They've got a national retrofit strategy there. I saw one of the questions was about supply chain certainty, and I think that is a big issue in this country. And one of the things that the Irish retrofit strategy did was secure the funding up until I think 2030, so that they have a pipeline of work that they know is stable. But they're also doing work around the health outcomes of people, for example, who have COPD and respiratory illnesses in retrofitted versus non-retrofitted homes. So I think we can't just take a blanket approach. We need to understand the fuel poverty levels, the health metrics, the grid capacity in a local area, and make kind of holistic decisions.
Thank you. Question from Tracy. How do we create more trust in the delivery of retrofit? So this kind of ties in with what you were saying about the organisation in Manchester, Rachel. There's a report called More Than Money, which highlights that knowledge gained via social or peer groups is a powerful incentive to carry out similar upgrades. Would you like to sort of elaborate on creating trust in the delivery of retrofit?
Yeah, I think that the community advocacy groups are really important here. And we've seen projects such as Retrofit Balsall Heath, where, you know, the demand has really come from the bottom up and has been led by sort of trusted sources within the community, rather than a sort of new retrofit organisation starting up and sort of planting itself in a place. That obviously then does put a lot of burden on people to do a lot of this work themselves. So I think there needs to be a balance between how much we expect from community organisations and how much we provide them in support. So I think there needs to be a lot more support for these types of organisations. I know that Innovate UK are funding some of these types of projects through its Fast Followers grant. We heard from a project in Norfolk that had been looking at how to specifically support different community groups to build this demand for retrofit. So I think, yeah, that's definitely a key part of the puzzle. But I also think the other part is measuring in-use data and making sure that that is available before, during, and after a retrofit, so we can really see that these outcomes are being delivered. And that then opens up potential for contracting that is more performance based, where you're getting a agreed upon performance from the work.
I think we've got time for one more quickly, which you have already touched on a little bit, and that's from Tom about the supply chain. So Tom says, it's very difficult to build a supply chain ecosystem with constant uncertainty coming from the government. And he cites the clean heat market mechanism, etc. Without this, can we ever build up the sector in time to given net zero targets? Let's finish with something positive.
Yeah. So I think there is a really positive news here. Yeah, the whole thing with the CHN is a real shame at the moment. But on the whole, I think government consistency of policy towards electrification and heat is stronger now than it has been ever. You know, there's £7,500 towards a heat pump, which is 50% more than it was this time last year. And I think, but the encouraging thing is, I think you've got the private sector now really kind of stepping up. So we talked a lot about banks. You know, Nationwide, biggest mortgage provider, will give you a £15,000 interest-free loan. Barclays will give you £2,000 just for installing a heat pump. And on the energy supplier side, we're starting to see really serious movements from people like OVO, who've got their heat pump type of use tariff, which is half the cost of a normal electricity tariff. You know, so there's really big movements, I would say, happening in the private sector that are starting to make things like heat pumps, for example, much more attractive and appealing to customers, which are, you know, going alongside the government support that is there. So I think, just in terms of a positive thing, there is a lot there, even though some things are inconsistent and being taken away.
Okay, I think with 2 seconds left, I think that's all time for today. Thank you to Elena and also Heather, Rachel and Will for joining us today. Thanks to everyone in the audience. See you all again in the webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I should also say National